Abedian. He's the CEO and chairman of Pan-African Capital Holdings. He's quite a well-respected and well-known economist and advisor on macroeconomic issues. He's an advisor to many public and private organizations. He's also one who serves the Baha'i faith quite well and quite intensely. I think without further ado, I'll hand over to Dr. Abedian to address us today.
Thank you very much, President. With your permission, I'm going to stand as a sign of respect to you. Also, I can see more of you. The subject that we're going to discuss this evening is the present state of humanity in the light of the events of 1844. When I was asked to talk about this, I thought, well, what does it all mean? So over the past few weeks, I've been agonizing, as Glennis would say, where do you start and where do you end? So let's start at the beginning. I want to spend about 2-3 minutes, maybe maximum 5 minutes, on a sort of participatory approach to how we see the state of humanity. Because sometimes we talk about the same concept, but we have a different perspective on it. We use the same terms, but the terms don't mean the same thing to everybody. Then, after you've helped me to summarize that section of it, I'll then go back to what happened in 1844 and bring it back here. And leave it hanging in the air, so that the next 5 sessions, they can build on it and bring it on earth. So let's start at the beginning. The state of the world as we see it, state of humanity. And in order to give it a little bit of structure, and not all of us going all over the place, I thought let's just categorize them into 2 groups. Not you, ideas. Let's first spend 2 minutes on how do we see the negative things in humanity. Not just in South Africa, humanity. Just a couple of them. We don't have time to write books about them. Just let's get on the same page. Who wants to start? If you think of negative things that afflicts humanity, what would jump to your head first?
Global warming.
Sorry?
Global warming.
Global warming? Poverty? Lack of morality, is that the correct way?
Inequality of men and women.
Pollution?
Prejudice.
Prejudice?
Inequality of men and women.
Inequality of gender, is can we call it? Are we on the same page? So we can go on, and the deeper we dig, as they say, the more we'll get on the same page. Let's now go on the positive sides. If you think of humanity as we experience it, the present day, what are some of the positive things that jumps to your mind or heart?
Technology.
Technology?
Communication.
Sorry?
Communication.
Communication?
Transport.
Transportation?
Innovation.
Innovation that never stops, yeah?
Eradication of the number of illnesses.
Yeah.
That's right. The pace at which we're dealing with illnesses as we sort of come across them.
Medicine in general.
Medicine, although some may disagree with you, but there are too many doctors here to think, so let's just... So are we on the same page that when we talk about the present state of humanity, it's not all bad or all good? Because sometimes people make it as if it's all negative stuff. It's not. So at best then, we got to ask, if we just what we shared with each other is true, why is it? What are the forces at play that you have such a vivid, generally agreed, as we quickly did within a minute, bad and good at the same time? What's going on? What's causing this social, emotional, psychological, political, economic, financial vortex that from it bellows out a lot of good and a lot of bad? Where did it start? Where is it going to? And why is it happening the way it is happening? For that, I'm going to invite you to now listen to a story. Don't have to believe it, it's a fact. Up to today is indisputable record of history. From today onwards, we'll factualize it together. And we don't have to judge each other. So there's no judgment, there is no pontification. Let's just go back to the history, 23rd of May, 1844. There are times in human history that are pivotal. For example, now we know that when Christ was born, it gave birth not to a child, it gave birth to a civilization, history. And that's not a dispute. You can walk anywhere, you'll see the churches, you'll see the hymns, you'll see musicians, composers, artists, architects, writers, glorifying the moment that a child was born. Because that child was not just a child, it was the inception of a particular era in taking humanity forward. When Moses led the tribes out of Egypt and brought them to cross the river, cross the sea, it wasn't just a trip of a few persecuted and socially marginalized group of people. Now we know that that episode marked a particular era that we celebrate, we glorify, we try to understand it. Therefore, a time is not just a time. Yes, as human beings, we have no other way than communicate and we say, oh, a child was born. Because that's the limitation of our language. How else do we intellectually define that moment? Or how else, and it doesn't matter which language you use, pick and choose, they all have the same limitations. They cannot fully capture, define, and explain the gravity of a particular incident. One of those years that future generation will no doubt celebrate is the 23rd of May 1844. And it wasn't just because somebody who was looking for somebody else, they happened to meet up. Because that time was in itself pregnant with all kinds of predictions. From the middle of Europe, what was then called Prussia, the now called German. In Germany, there was a whole movement. Templars. German Templars. Their debate, their calculations, their predictions, their human feeling, and I want to use the term gut feeling because it was not gut feeling, it was a much bigger feeling that something eminent is going to happen. 3 years parallel with that, 3 decades before that, a group in the Middle East, at that time Iraq and Iran, in the name of Sheikhs, they had pretty much the same type of feelings based on their scriptures, much like the German Templars based on the biblical predictions that something has to happen. Quite frankly, ever since then, it hasn't stopped. Every so often you see a group predict that 2011 will be the end of the world. Then they get it wrong, they say, no, we meant be 2012. No, it must, I don't know if you read this, it hasn't stopped. Why? Because there is something in the collective spirit of human being that say, look, things have to change. The way that we experience it is not meant to be, and we don't know why, and therefore they go to their scriptures, if they are Jewish or Buddhist or Hindus or Muslims or whatever they are, they try to find clues as to when and what is going to happen. So much the same in 1820s, 30s, and up to 1843, there was a movement based in Karbala, in what is today called Iraq. Those days it was under the Ottoman Empire, a whole scholarly group that had produced unprecedented articulation of the predictions that this is now the time of the end, apocalyptic predictions. The term apocalyptic means what? Means revelation. I know we're all talking about apocalypse as if this is the bad thing, end of the world. It's a very positive thing. Apocalyptic predictions is about the birth of new revelations. That apocalyptic feelings which have come from different and diverse holy books, whether in the middle of Europe or in the middle of the Islamic holy nations of the Middle East, in Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia at the time, and up until now, all of them had this apocalyptic predictive movements in some or other form. The last, in 1843, was the Sheikhia groups who the teacher, Said Kazem, says, that's it, now you must go out and look for the promise. And amongst his teachers, a 31-year-old, the name is Mullah Hussein, arrives with his colleagues and his comrades, his classmates, and these are each on their own scholarly, learned people. These are not like me who are students and they never graduate. In their own, they had written books and commentaries. But they knew that studying is no more conducive to finding the apocalyptic time, figure. So they were going from place to place, and they arrived in the city of Shiraz. On the 23rd May, when Mullah Hussein meets a younger, he's 31, and he meets a younger man who is between 25 and 26. The charm and the attraction of this individual, who invites him to his house, Mullah Hussein follows. This is the story. Go with the story. The beauty of it is, although that evening, roughly 2 hours after the sunset, two young men met, they exchanged some words, but that moment marked, much like the birth of Christ, a moment that was a pivotal moment in the history of human consciousness, in the history of human civilization. It's a pivotal moment in the sense that it released into the body of human existence as well as to physical existence, full stop. It generated, it infused a new spirit. And I will shortly share with you the actual text so that you rest assured that I'm not dramatizing, so that I stay true to the facts of the event. That moment, humanity changed. At that moment, it's also important to contextualize, not only from a religious perspective, that Christian, such as German Templars, as well as Muslims, the Sheikhia group and others, were in search of a new apocalyptic episode. At the same time, secularists, led by no other than Karl Marx, that I'm sure you all heard, in Europe, was questioning scientifically, sociopolitically, that the regime that they were experiencing was doomed to self-destruction. Capitalism, Marx said, and wrote Das Kapital, the big book, which became the Bible of a social movements of a communist socialist, and up to today, a great deal of it remains relevant for what we experience in the socio-economic sphere. They too, philosophically, sociologically, and politically, concluded that something very different had to happen. Just share that with you as a footnote so that the story is not a religious story. It's not a group of churchmen or mullahs or some scholars who are nose in the books they're predicting. Those who were not religious also had these apocalyptic expectations. Be as it may, 23rd of May 1844 ushered in, infused, revealed, and proclaimed that this is a new era in human consciousness, in the evolution of humanity. The Bab, which means the gate in English, and that term itself has got textual, holy text origin, and I'm not a theologian, and our discussion is not about that, so it is not accidental that he called himself the Bab or the gate. The origin of it is in the text, both in the Bibles as well as in the Islamic holy scriptures. We park that only to make the point that none of the events that took place, none of the terminologies that were used, none of the predictions that were made were accidental, nor is what we experience now. It is the linkages that I like for you to reflect on. So the Bab declares to his visitor that I am the promised one. And of course there were conditions. Mullah Hussein, who himself had spent his lifetime studying, knew that the promised one had to have certain capabilities. And one of the important conditions that he had put for himself, and his teacher had told him, that when you look for the promised one, the first sign that you will see that he on his own will volunteer to write a commentary about a chapter of the Holy Book of Islam, Quran, which is called the Surah of Joseph. Joseph, as you know, is one of the central figures of not just Islam, but Christianity. There is a big story about Joseph and his father and his brothers and Egypt. It's a social commentary on what was happening at that time. So the figure of Joseph, both from a story point of view, but also from a spiritual point of view, as stipulated and reiterated in Quran, is extremely intriguing. Many commentators over the 1,200 years of Islam, and even many more in the history of Christianity and Judaism, have tried to unpack in histories the intriguing elements of the story of Joseph. So Mullah Hussein had been told that the signs of the promised one is that he must on his own volunteer to write a commentary on the story of Joseph. And when Mullah Hussein looks at the Bab volunteers to write a commentary on the story of Joseph. The book, which was supposed to be a commentary, became a book over many years. That event, that sign, that volunteering that I will write a commentary on Surah of Joseph, isn't that what you were expecting? Became the beginning of 6 years of unstoppable, most complex, most intriguing, at the same time most illuminating revelations like never before. In Islam, there is a tradition from Prophet Muhammad that all the prophets of God, all the knowledge that they have brought to us, is equivalent to 2 letters. And when the promised one comes, he will bring the other 25 letters and will complete knowledge. So Muslims and Muslim scholars, obviously over the centuries, have always had this sort of contradiction in a way. On the one hand, they expect the promised one to bring all the knowledge, but at the same time they believe that when it comes, the world ends. So what do you need the knowledge for if it ends? It just doesn't somehow, in that simplistic, literally understanding of this tradition, it doesn't make sense. The Bab, however, literally brought a non-stoppable flow of revelations. To just give you a couple of examples, and this is just because we haven't got time, if you put all the revealed books of all the religions, all of them, up to 23rd of May 1844, even if you believe that whatever various chapters of various books were actually revealed by the Prophet, and those who memorized it, they memorized it exactly right, it's less than 2,000 pages. Right? All of them. The Bab, in one of his books, which is called the Book of Divine Names, wrote 3,000 pages on the concept of divine names. And up to today, the totality of Bab's revelation is not fully compiled. Simply because at that time, we can actually, I've written this and I hope if I'm misrepresenting the messenger of God, they'll forgive me when I arrive that side. I thought about it, and I've been a Baha'i for about 40 years now. And as you know, they always say ignorance is bliss. Then I realized more bliss than ignorance is when you know a little thing and you think you understood it. Because you walk around thinking that I know it all. Until 9 months ago, when a friend of mine gave me this book, we were in a study group, and she says, you know, I've ordered this book online, and this book frustrates me because I can't read it. Every time I read a paragraph, I just say, okay, what does it do? I close it down, and then two weeks later, and so on. And this book is called Gate of the Heart, Understanding the Writings of the Bab. Of course, she thinks that I'm any better than her. She says, okay, why don't you read? And then we have a study group together. That was 9 months ago. And I had to look at this book and say, okay, 2-3 weeks, I'll crack it. I finished it the day before yesterday. And it's only because I was nervous about this discussion tonight, I thought, let me just finish this book. At least I get something. And only when I finished it, I realized that all the confidence that I had was absolutely misplaced. Because a lot of things that I thought I understood, they were absolutely confused. So the Bab is the only messenger of God that we know up to now who did not address his followers. Remember when the story of Christ followers were around, he would give sermon, Moses would do the same, Prophet Muhammad would do the same thing. So the mode of communication, the mode of revelation, the mode of infusion of power into human soul before was through the utterances of messengers of God. The Bab didn't talk to them. The Bab would just write. And the followers, like Mullah was saying that night on the 23rd of May 1844, he was mesmerized by the speed with which, the fluidity with which the Bab would write. And thought, wow, no human being can do that. And not just write anything. Scribbling might be able to do with that speed, but to generate verses that are in the same tone, in the same substance, and with the same power as the book Quran itself was a sign for Mullah saying that that's it. I have no more question. The Bab went further. Told Mullah saying that go back to your friends, but say nothing. Do not teach, do not promote, do not at all indicate that you are excited or you are elevated. You can't go to sleep because you've been in touch with somebody who claims to be the promised one. Why? Because the Bab said, I need another 17. You and another 17, just like you, independently should find me, by whatever means. And only then I'll tell you what to do. So the poor Mullah Hussain, as you can imagine, is both excited because he has found the purpose of his life, at the same time frightened, at the same time quiet. That must be, if we put ourselves into that space, it must be a very unique feeling. So Mullah Hussain says nothing, the Bab keeps writing, and in a shorter space of time, 17 others, in their own wild and wonderful ways, recognize the promised one. They declare their faith in the Bab. One of them, which is possibly the most intriguing and possibly the most influential soul human being in the history of revelation, and I'll come back to this point, is a woman called Tahara, who in her dreams meets the Bab and recognizes the Bab. That's how intriguing the events of 1844 were. When the 18th person appears and recognizes the Bab from behind, he's a 20-year-old, 22-year-old, by the name of Quddus. When that circle of 18 first believers completes, the Bab gives them a letter of, it refers to them as the living letters. Letters of living, letters of soul, letters of life. And these 19 individuals, together with the Bab, 19, 18 plus himself, they constitute a very interesting constellation of a spiritual force. The Bab himself, whose bicentenary we celebrate this year around the globe, is the subject of our discussion, which is the central figure, the central force, the pivotal spirit of what we experience as humanity today. He calls himself, I am the primal point. And I like to quote him from himself. And stay with the point. We'll come back to this. The Bab says, I am the primal point from which have been generated all created things. It's not talking about religion. It's not talking about the spiritual stuff. And there is no interpretation here. It says, I am the primal point from which have been generated all created things. And then he says, in another piece, the point round which the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve. These are, by any definition, mind-boggling, stupendous, earth-shattering, if you see it from one perspective. But put yourself in the other perspective, in a society that was filled with a particular perception of religion, a particular definition of what the promised one should be. Not much different from what we see nowadays in different denominations. The return of Christ, Messiah. If you ask Muslims, depending which denomination they are, whether they believe in the return of Christ or the appearance of Ghaem, all of them, they have a particular, like human beings, they've got a particular perception of what the return of Christ should look like, or what Ghaem should look like, or what Messiah should look like, or other religions the same. So of course in that society, in those social, religious, political conditions of the 1840s, this type of claim was absolutely the product of a madman. Who else can come and say, I am the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve? I am the primal point from which have been generated all created things. Not just a few things, not things in the west or in the east, in the oceans or on the land, all created things. And that, of course, brings us to the importance of 1844 and that particular pivotal point in the history of mankind. The Bab begins a new cycle and closes a new cycle. It spends 2 years, writes thousands upon thousands of pages to articulate, to explain what these various concepts in religious books are. And his writings are incredibly impossible to read simply because he does not abide by the rules of humanity. He is a disruptive force by any definition. He disrupts religious interpretation. He disrupts understanding of concepts. He disrupts language, Arabic, Persian. He writes in both of them. He blends them. He spent 3,000 pages to reconfigure what people knew of definitions like God, like an attribute of God. He creates derivatives from derivatives of the same word of God. And then he says, the entire creation can be defined with one point, if only you understand it. He spends thousands upon thousands of pages, doesn't talk. True to form, if Prophet Muhammad said he will bring all knowledge, that's what he did. He brought all knowledge. He did not give sermons. And his followers knew that if they had questions, they could write to him. He will respond. But he went more than that. He not only wrote, but he would catalog what he has revealed. So there is no confusion. What was revealed when? But with his own hand, he had created 2 catalogs of his own revelations. Of course, for centuries to come, when we eventually get the totality of his revelation, we will begin to redefine language. His writings are complex because not only he does not abide by the so-called rules of linguistic grammars, but he goes more than that. He mixes symbols and numbers. As you would know in the Hebrew language and Arabic language, letters have numerical value. And the Bab is the master of mixing numbers and symbols within the symbols and pulling from the Bible and from Quran and from tradition. Heaven helps you if you are not familiar with those, or you've forgotten some of them. Therefore, the revolution that the Bab introduced was very, very troubling. It troubled the linguists, it troubled the religious authorities, it troubled those who thought they had very good, deep understanding of religious concepts. For example, they thought they understood what the story of Joseph was about. He put a whole sword through it and said, think again. So the story of Joseph, the redefinition of it, the reinterpretation of it, the reapplication of it to today's world, although we all have been told from childhood that this is the story of Joseph brothers and the father back in the old Egypt, the Bab says it's about now and the future. That's how revolutionary he reinterpreted, recast the mode of revelation. The mode of revelation have been holy books, full of symbols, full of allegories, and the Bab said we need to go back to the drawing board. The events of history, as recorded to what happened to his followers during 6 years, is recorded by the French, the British, and some Russian scholars. The most distinguished of these scholars, to just make the point that this event, this disruption, in fact this eruption, did not stay in the Middle East. It very quickly went to Europe, and possibly the most famous scholar that has spent a lot of time understanding, recording, analyzing, and commenting in that period is a British scholar from Cambridge, Granville Edward Brown, an Orientalist who got so captured or captivated intellectually by the advent of the Bab and the Babi movement, because the rapidity with which, the awesomeness of the impact that a group of seemingly young, in their 20s and 30s and 40s, religious movements shattered the stability of Iran and parts of Iraq was unbelievable. The Russian diplomats and the French diplomats, who at that time were the dominant forces, colonial forces, and they had headquarters or consular services in Tehran, they wrote about this thing because they could not believe it. Every aspect of it was unbelievable. Here you have a prophet who doesn't congregate, who doesn't come and give sermons, but people get attracted to him. Here is somebody who writes, his writings are is not accessible to people, and yet it inspires people. Does that make sense? Imagine we all get a few pieces of, these days of course would be in WhatsApp form, but those days there wasn't. People that have transcribed and they read this thing and it questions everything, you don't understand half of it, but you get excited by it and you're prepared to give your life away. It cannot be a human phenomenon, it has to be apocalyptic, they thought. So a French counselor who was in Tehran wrote about this because he thought this was just a phenomenon on its own. And Edward Brown, who was at that time a young scholar at Cambridge, interested in mysticism, goes to the library, comes across this book and says, wow, this is a new thing. I'm going to go to Persia, live amongst them, learn the language, and see what is this all about. It's too good to be true. So Edward Brown then spends just about the rest of his life trying to understand what the Bab is all about, what the Babi movement is all about. He studies the language, the Arabic and the Persian, and he interacts with a lot of Bahá'ís, leaders and believers right across the social strata, from the not so educated to the scholars. And he writes, he never became a Bahá'í, but he was as good and as close to a defendant of the Bahá'í movement. Just to make the point that the events of 1844 did not stay in Iran, in Iraq or Saudi Arabia, it very quickly, like wildfire, was being debated at that time in France, in UK and in Russia. We don't have time to go through the history of it, just to make the point that the Bab continued his revelations non-stop. Whether it was in prison, whether it was his home, under home arrest the first year of his time from 84 to 85, he never stopped writing. The history, for those of you who are interested, the list of his revelations, the one that are now at least catalogued at the International Bahá'í Center, they are being now, in a way, authenticated. Because one of the things that he would do when he revealed, he would make copies of them. 4 or 5 of them. And say, okay, you go and transcribe, and you go to your region, and you go to your region, and therefore now that there are many copies of the same book, the international Bahá'í community has to authenticate that these are correct. So that process, as you can imagine, is going to take a few decades. But they are working through them, and it is not like what we know before. It is not a holy book that if you get it right, it's a book of a couple of 100 pages. It's not. One of them, as I mentioned, is the longest revealed book on its own, 3,000 pages. Then, towards the end of his life, before he was executed or martyred in 1850, he wrote 2 books, one in Persian, one in Arabic, which was called Bayan. Of course, we as human beings, however learned, however intelligent, however spiritual, however whatever, we can never ever really understand the manifestations of God. We can never understand Christ. It is not in our capability. The same way that this disc can never, however beautifully made, can never understand you and I. It is not in its status to relate to our status. Much the same, prophets of God, Moses, Christ, Buddha, Krishna, Muhammad, Baha'u'llah, the Bab, they are creatures of their own. They live in the world of Holy Spirit as we know it. Again, this language is a limitation of the language. The Bab over and over and over and again warns us that whatever language you use, however articulate you think you are insignificant in trying to describe what you're talking about. So, yes, we talk about messengers of God because that's the only thing we know. That's the best that we have invented so far. And the Bab says, as humanity evolves, language will become spiritualized. So he has a whole lot of revelations which, for the want of a better term, in English we may call it, and I don't know, you can correct me if it's not the best that one could do, is the lexicon of a spiritual linguistics. It's a complicated term. I'm trying to rise to the occasion. Because lexicon is the best that English can offer in terms of new vocabulary and so on. Spiritual, the Bab is very clear that this dispensation in the history of human evolution, unlike in the past, is all about the spiritualization of humankind. Remember from the beginning that we casually or for very good reasons, and Kwesi referred to, from Adam onwards, right? This is the cycle from Adam to the Bab. It's a cycle that has helped us to get where we are up until 1844. The Bab says that cycle is now ended. At the same time, at the same moment, on the 23rd of 1844, the Bab says a new cycle begins. This cycle is a cycle of fulfillment. The fulfillment of the destiny of humankind, and if we are quite honest with ourselves, it's really since then that we actually talk about humankind. Before, our mode of identification was, I am Mexican, I am black, I am white, I am Zulu, I am Japanese, whatever. Our mode of identification, and still part of it is into our DNA, we don't really, deep down, our default mode, if you like, is not to identify ourselves as humans. Because we've been taught for thousands of years that you are either part of tribe of Israel, or you are Arab, or you are this, or you are Persian, etc., etc. The Bab says, from 1844, means will be created, energies will be generated, thoughts will come to everybody's head for the first time, such that we'll actually develop the right language, the right technology. Remember some of the good things that we said? The right technology, the right communication, the right transportation, right? Fast enough exchanges of ideas to do what? To give expression to a new cycle in the consciousness of humankind. A consciousness that when it consummates, when it reaches its apex, will spiritualize humankind. What does it mean, spiritualize? We will talk differently. We will think differently. We will act differently. We will be different. And the Bab says, in this dispensation, we human beings, as we have evolved, we will have arrived at the sanctuary of the heart. So a lot of the writings of the Bab talks about the importance of the heart. Remember, we always as human beings somehow pride ourselves, and quite correctly so, but when we want to pride ourselves, we refer to our head. We are an intelligent being, therefore we are different from monkeys. That's how we pride ourselves. Or we are clever. Cleverness is implicitly an attribute of mind. So the Bab spends a lot of time telling us, guys, you are barking at the wrong tree. Get real. Sorry, I'm not paraphrasing him. It's me. Get real. Focus on your heart. That is the distinguishing feature of the creature called human being. The distinguishing feature of a human being is not because he or she can think, because he's got a capability, heart that can reflect the spiritual realities. And then the Bab says, you know what? Not only you're all one kind and all the same, and of course we knew, we had an inkling of it. In the Bible they had told us that we all were created by the same dust. But we didn't know what it meant. We thought it's a poetic type of feel-good type of thing that the Prophet had to say. The Bab says no, it's a lot more complex than that. Not only you are from the same being, but your reality is at one with your physical environment. So you cannot separate yourself from the vegetables and from the rivers and from the trees and from the animals and from the insects and from anything that exists. So he spends a lot of time talking about the importance of unity, the source of which he says is the primal point. Because everything that you want to write, everything that you want to draw, everything that you want to create, even the thought that you want to flesh out, begins with a point. And he says, I am the primal point, through which all generated things have been created. And then he says, our physical existence whatever we are, or things that we do, it's a reflection of the spiritual existence. So there's a reality, a spiritual reality, and there is a physical reality that we dabble in on our way to the other reality. But these two realities are not separate. They are one and the same thing. And just think about that. This oneness, which constitutes the central piece of the theological commentaries of the Bible, it's about a new dispensation in which a new era, a new cycle that could last as long as 500,000 years. So if you feel inadequate, don't worry, there's enough time to catch up. It is not a quick fix. It's not meant to be a quick fix, but the foundation of it began in 1844. 23rd of May, 1844. With that pronouncement that at this moment, all beings, not just us, all beings, have been infused with a new power, a new spirit. Why? Because if the totality, the Bible says, if the totality of existence is one, I cannot infuse human beings with new power, but not animals. Then they would be out of balance. So he says, we have recreated everything at this moment, and each and every one has got new potentialities, empowered by the new spirit. Just think about it. It sounds very good, but when I get up in the morning and I see all these havocs around us, and some of it we just, at the beginning, we sort of itemized, we got to put it in that context. That since 1844, nothing is what it used to be. Nothing can be as it used to be. For example, if you look at the language, and this is what the Bible spends a lot of time confusing us, he says language that you use is a problem. Because that language is out of sync with what's happening around us. For example, we talk about power. Power is not what power used to be. We talk about power, but it's not. We talk about religion. Religion is not what religion used to be. Political leaders were not. Economic leaders were not. Right? So every concept that we use, including parenthood, by the way, parenthood had a particular meaning. Childhood, all these were hierarchical. Now, before 1844 and even up to now, in the generality of mankind, the term parent and child connotes not oneness, connotes hierarchy. Government connotes, oh, they are up here, we are down here. We even have things like they are leaders and we are subjects. Huh? Isn't it? So the Bible says that era has passed. We need to use language in a very different way. And the language that we use, even if the terminology is the same, we need to spiritualize it. Which means we need to redefine it for a different era, cycle in human beings. Can you see how confusing it can be? Because, and then it gets more confusing because the Bob has got three stations. One, he is the primal point through which all manifestations, right, get their infusion of Holy Spirit. He himself is one of them, and then he's a human being in look. So at one moment, when he's a human being, he is submissive to the Creator, to the Holy Spirit. But at another point, he talks to himself as a messenger of God. And then he dictates or prescribes, if you like, to human beings what they should and shouldn't do. In his own personal capacity, he submits to them. Are you with me? I hope I didn't confuse you too much. But it's taken me 6 months to understand this, what's going on in this verse, in this chapter, as to in what capacity the Bible is revealing his terms. So, In 1844, and ever since, the challenge that humanity has is to reconfigure itself, to identify these negative things, much like an ocean, a massive ocean, that has got a lot of filth, a lot of unwanted items, a lot of alien subjects that has to be thrown out. At the same time, an ocean that has to be regenerative. Create oxygen, if you like. Create the cycle of the moon. Give life to the plants. Ensure sustainability of the ecosystem. Do I make sense? And that's the job of the oceans. We look at them, but in their bellowing in and out, in their throwing out the unwanted and do it at the same time, they regenerate without which we could not sustain life on the planet. And ever since then, that simple apocalyptic moment has changed the fortune of humankind in all and every aspects. If we are honest with ourselves, we do not seem to be in charge. And in that, there is an exciting process at play. Because we cannot understand the gravity of the status of messengers of God, of whom Bob was a very unique one. We can only really listen to another messenger of God to say what they are about. And in the Baha'i dispensation, luckily we have two manifestations of God who came in a very close succession. The Bab revealed himself in 1844, and 9 years after that, in 1853, as the Bab had promised himself, a new manifestation of God revealed himself, Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah has this to say about the Bab. Baha'u'llah says, "Magnify thou, O Lord my God, him who is the primal point, the divine mystery, the unseen essence, the day spring of divinity, and the manifestation of thy lordship. Through whom," and this is a punchline, through the Bab, through whom all the knowledge of the past and all the knowledge of the future were made manifest. So you don't have to interpret the stuff. You don't have to believe any other human being saying, this is a manifestation of God. And for the Baha'is, this manifestation of God is a supreme manifestation of God. He himself says, all that I know and the future will bring was brought by the Bab. And hence my statement before that I said the theological foundation of the Baha'i faith in this dispensation is revealed by the Bab. And Baha'u'llah says, the station of the Bab, he is the king of the messengers, and his book is the mother book. And then in Baghdad in 1852, just before his revelation, in 1862. This is another statement by Baha'u'llah. He says, amongst them all, Baha'u'llah was being really harassed by some of his Babis and some of his family and some of the Ottoman Empire, both inside and outside, they had rallied against him. And then he says, amongst them all, we stand, Baha'u'llah says, life in hand, wholly resigned to his will, that perchance, through God's loving kindness and his grace, this revealed and manifest letter may lay down his life as a sacrifice in the path of the primal point. The most exalted one. So to understand the gravity of the Bab's event, the event of 1844, as human beings, we have two means of getting a feel for it. One is to honestly look back and see what has happened to humanity since 1844. without any judgment. And up to today. To see if what the Bab proclaimed at that time is what we experience. And you don't have to say anything, you don't have to confess anything. Stand in front of the mirror and talk to yourself. And see whether what the Bab said has happened. The second measure, the second index of gravity is what Baha'u'llah himself says. Imagine if the supreme manifestation of God says, my wish is that perchance through God's loving kindness and His grace, this manifest letter Baha'u'llah may lay down his life for the primal point, then that in a way captures the status of the Bab. So to wrap it up, I can go on. I've been 9 months reading, agonizing, and crying at times, literally, because you have a self-respect for what you understand. And then when you get to my age, you sort of expect yourself to understand things a little bit better than when you were 40 years ago. And then you read something 12 times and you say, what is this about? How do I make sense of this? And then you go to a couple of references and you come back and you read it and you sleep on it and so on, and then you get in the morning and you get excited after shaving that, what, now I got it. And then you read it and say, no, it doesn't make sense. So it is the nature of the time. It's the nature of, and I'm not in a way excusing myself, I'm saying what the Bab has told us is reinvent yourself. And he goes to the minutia of what refinement means, what the sanctuary of heart means, what the task of human beings in whatever they do. For example, and this was really exciting, also depressing for me, the Bab says, if an architect designs a building, and this building is beautiful, but it's not the best that that architect could have done. For as long as this building is up, this building is going to complain in the creation that you could have done better, why didn't you do a little better? Then I ask myself, I do a lot of things during the day. I clean, I talk to people, I do business, I sometimes teach. Do I really pass that test? Do I clean the best that I could? Do I dress the best I could? The Bab puts a lot of emphasis on cleanliness, on how you dress. Because the way we present ourselves is not just about me. I may be sloppy and smelly, you suffer from it. Isn't it? If I come unclean, the Bab says you cannot do that to the creatures of God. You need to be sensitive to what they feel, how they receive you. So it's not about you, it's about how you perceive yourself in the unity of existence. So he puts a lot of emphasis on how you should clean, how you should present yourself. He abrogates a whole lot of Islamic and non-Islamic laws about, for example, you couldn't in those days wear silk. The Bab says if silk suits you the best, that's what you should do. If gold is what you can afford and what makes you presentable and not you, make you pleasant to the eyes of others, for their sake you should do it. And he redefines, it can go on and on, but this is about refinement that I'm sharing with you, about how much we have to change. He says there is talk of holy war. The Muslims do it, the Christians, the Jews, all of them, even now as we sit here, part of India, in the name of holy war, they kill each other. He says the holy war is a good one. You should actually do it. But there is a condition. No human being should suffer. But then what holy war becomes? If no human being should suffer, what is then the purpose of holy war? Any ideas? It's the war within yourself. You got to take up the swords to slay the ego of self, the imperfection. the negative thought, the laziness, the lack of attention to details, the lack of attention to sensitivity of other human beings, or not just human beings, how other parts of physical creation will be. They didn't worry about the environment and pollution and so on, but that is what it's all about. It's about a holy war against whatever is not holy. And polluting the air, polluting your mouth, being insensitive to people, whoever they are, whatever the pretext, race, gender, nationality, tribal affiliation, you name it. How often we, the so-called followers of the Bahá'í, never mind those who haven't heard of it, we are so insensitive in our expression. I just scratched my head and I said, look, I really don't want to read this book anymore because now it gets very close and personal. It's not about anybody else. I don't want to go on and on. I hope you got a glimpse of what the Bab is about. It is at once tremendously confusing, incredibly disruptive, at the same time gentle, to the absolute conceivable limit. In fact, what attracted Mullah Hussein that night to follow this young man was because he was so gentle. He was so unbelievably, uniquely attractive in his gentleness, in his demeanor. Not because he was loud and impressive in his pronouncement. He was so gentle that you couldn't say no to him. You couldn't not follow him. And in many of his revelations and articulations, the Bab is incredibly gentle in his pronouncements. So much so that after 18 months of his first revelation, when his writings spreads amongst his believers and amongst the wider society in Iraq and Iran, and causes commotions, and some people get really traumatized, the Bab says, okay, I'm going to stop writing anymore. Because I can see these people are suffering, they are traumatized, believers and non-believers. So the Bab is a very interesting configuration, combination of gentleness at one extreme and absoluteness, absolute, like as they say in English, hot knife through the butter. There is no vacillation. And that is the primal point, the pivoting force that since 1844 has shaped and will continue to shape the environment in which you and I live. It is exciting. At the same time, it's frightening. Because this ocean bellows day and night. It bellows because humanity is destined for such distinctive, such incredibly exciting destination to become, in this cycle, a spiritual being. Not just driven by head, but on the sanctuary of the heart, in the concept, in the understanding of unity. Unity of not just human beings, unity of physical existence. And not just physical existence as we understand it, a physical existence which in itself is inseparable from our spiritual existence. And how important this journey is, I like to end it with one description that if you thought all of that I tried and I hopefully succeeded to some extent to give you a glimpse of what it's all about, is that it is not just in a spiritual sense that the Bab is the centerpiece, the point, the epicenter of the spiritual regeneration of a cycle of human consciousness and evolution that is lasting 500,000 years. His body, after it was shot by 750 bullets, and intermingled with a friend, is now buried in Haifa at the foot of this building. Some of you may have been there, seen it.
Yeah.
Now, this is the shrine of the Bab. Not only in a spiritual sense, the Bab is the primal point around which all creation has been regenerated. As we sit here, his very body is best described by Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi is the guardian of the Baha'i faith in a book called, and I'll find it just now, I got so many notes that I got myself confused. Shoghi Effendi explains the importance of the remains of the Bab as buried in that shrine. The book is called Citadel of Faith. It's a relatively small, 100-odd pages book, and Shoghi Effendi describes the importance of the point, the place at which the shrine of the Bab is located. As I conclude this, it's important to also make the point that the shrine of the Bab, for those who have biblical and Christian background, is pretty much in the proximity of the Elijah cave, the cave of Elijah, which has got its own significance. In a spiritual sense, the Bab, in a way, is the return of Elijah. So that the point that he is buried, the location of his burial, is not accidental. I mentioned that the forces that are around us are not accidental, good and bad or in between. Everything that has happened since 1844 is not accidental. And Baha'u'llah himself pointed at a place where the shrine of the Bab should be. And the guardian of the Baha'i faith explains that this place, the remain of the Bab, is, and think of it as a set of circles. The guardian calls it the concentric centers, 9 of them. And this is how he describes it. This is on page 95 of the Citadel of Faith. For just as in the realm of the spirit, the reality of the Bab has been hailed by the author of the Baha'i revelation, Baha'u'llah, the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve. Remember, the physical and the spiritual reality are reflecting each other. So in the spiritual sense, Baha'u'llah says, round the point of the Bab, primal point, round whom the realities of the prophets and the messengers revolve. So on this visible plane, his sacred remains constitute the heart and center of what may be regarded as 9 concentric circles, paralleling thereby and adding further emphasis on the central position accorded by the founder of our faith to one for whom God has caused to proceed the knowledge of all that was and shall be. The primal point from which have been generated all created things. So both in material existence and in a spiritual existence, Bab constitutes the primal point around which concentric centers of oneness rotates or exists or assumes meaning. That is how our life is at the moment. I'll stop here, and I hope you managed to get in between my confused presentations a glimpse of what the Bab is about, how 23rd of May 1844 will be a pivotal point
Next week.
in the history of mankind. That is next week. And this year, not just the night, but this year, in itself, in the annals of history, constitutes a very unique period. Let me stop. Over to you. Thank you. were excited that I stopped. Wonderful.